Here is Colorverse Coast Redwood. This is a dark red of a black cherry variety. This swatch is a great representation of the color we get in the writing sample, not something that always happens. There is a very slight tone shift as paper changes, though it needs to be side by side to even have a chance of seeing it. It does shade from very dark as a red to extremely dark as a red. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs well enough to use, but you lose some of the specialness of this ink. I really like the very dark red in how it isn't just a red, but comes across with something more that it kind of it's undefinable to me. It's a bit more. Yes, I would love a bottle of this ink.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M800. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Very dark, beautiful black cherry red on the page. Really, the color right there. This is amazing. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does have a little bit of shading. You look at sort on the first line, and the soar is lighter than the T. But for the most part, we get very dark writing, which makes me very happy in what I'm seeing here. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, easily continuing our notes back here.
More than one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks.
Here is Colorverse Extra Dimension. Here is Colorverse Under the Shade. Here is Colorverse Rainy Day.
Here is Colorverse Vortex Motion. The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade. When you look at any on the second line, the AN is lighter than the Y. You can see a little bit of shading going on in Element, where you see three different shades, where the EL is lighter than the EMEN, and the T at the end does get a whole lot darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, making this a great story.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. In general, just a little lighter. Again, it's only the side-by-side that you even stand a chance of seeing it. I see very occasional moments of tiny feathering, not as something I'm going to worry about on this paper. It is not distracting. There's no spread. There's very little shading. You can find it when you look further into what's happening, like further on the second line where the F is darker than the UR, but the TH in the middle, much darker. Look, there's a little bit of feather right there. And the ER at the end lightened just a little bit in tone. I don't believe this to be getting modified in its tone by the tone of the paper. I think we have an opaque ink here. Looking at the back of the page, there's only a couple of spots that it got a little deeper into the paper. Nothing that would stop me from writing on the back of the page. Ghosting's not a problem, and it never bled through touching the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, this smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, barely any shading. You really have to go looking for it on this paper. It stands out against the quad rule with no problem. This, if you are using this paper, is a beautiful ink on this paper. I am enjoying this very dark cherry red a lot. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more red inks.
Here is Noodler's Cardinal Kestrel. Here is Private Reserve Vampire Red. Here is Cairo Iro Flaming Red of Fishuma. Here is Waterman Audacious Red.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, little bit flatter, still looking very, very nice as a sort of that black cherry. It's really very much still there. No feather, no spread, some light shading going on. I say light shading because we get a dark red and a very dark red standing out against the quad rule with no problem. If you are a student using this, you deserve some extra credit points because you have made a great choice. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, showing how good this paper really is for fountain pens.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Kayo Oto Noriba Iro. Here is Private Reserve Gray Flannel. Here is Ackerman, their number 3 Ackerman Blue. Here is Noodler's Bad Black Moccasin.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, but we do get an expected amount of spread for being on copy paper. We get almost nothing for shading. We don't get the same, it's not a classic red. It's not the same black cherry red that we've been seeing. It's slightly different. It is not as enjoyable a red here. This, for the color, I don't think is the best combination. Looking at the back of the page, you see that there is some ghosting going on. Not too bad. There's nothing that bleeds through touching the page underneath. I do think you could get away with writing on both sides of the paper with this ink.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Pelikan M800 medium nib is a wet writer that gives a gorgeous black cherry red with seeds of shading throughout. Off camera, I tried this in a dry medium. Both the tone and the shading remain unchanged. Easy choice, as this is such a boring, rich ink, and it is in how predictable the performance and the tone are. So, dealer's choice. Ink up that favorite pen and enjoy.